Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring, which is going to be all about haunted Chicago. Now, why haunted Chicago? Well, at the time that I'm recording this, it is the middle of summer, it is hot, there have been heat waves all around the world, and I love it. I love the heat, I love the sun and the heat, but I know that many of my folklore-loving friends do not love it. And they are looking forward, they cannot wait for the cooler temperatures that will come in the fall. And they are looking forward to spooky season. So I thought I would try to do my part and talk about some very chilling tales from Chicago to see if I can help cool you off a little bit. And if I can't, well, hopefully it'll get you thinking about the fall and all things that are going to come in, like I said, spooky season. But before I get into all of that, as I said, it's summer right now, it's very hot, and I have been doing a ton of folkloring, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. You may know some of this if you're following me on Blue Sky or TikTok or even Instagram, but a couple of things I've been doing. I've been going out every day and gathering mulberries off my mulberry tree, which I love. I think mulberries are amazing. It is, as a child, the very first food that I ever foraged. And it was shocking to me that I could just walk up to this tree and there were berries, I could pick them and eat them. It always brings back such good memories of my childhood and the wonder that I felt learning that I could just do this and there was food right there that I could eat. Other things that I've been doing, I kind of ran out of everything at once. So I had to make some toothpaste, I had to make some deodorant, I had to make my magnesium lotion, although I'm not sure how soon I am going to be using that because, as I said, it's hot and it's sweaty and I'm sweaty and I don't want to get any stickier. Still loving the heat, but I just don't want to feel clammy and sticky. So anyway, it has also been, I've been gathering up early stuff that I've planted. I've been getting a lot of lettuce lately, which is great, but in one of the recent heat waves, the lettuce did turn a little bit bitter, which happens when it's hot. I don't mind a bitter flavor sometimes. I don't want too much bitter, but I've got a ton of lettuce, so I'm going to keep gathering that up. I also have got my cilantro and my dill and my basil are just like going crazy. Now, I think with the basil, I am going to do some caprese salads and not sure what else I'm going to make with that. But I don't know what to do with the dill and the cilantro. I have to figure out how to store either one of those. Do I freeze them? I don't think I dry them, but I need to dive into that. So if y'all have any ideas, feel free to mention it to me. I'd be very excited. Now, one final thing before I start on the episode, and that is a new series that I've been looking at doing all about people's personal folklore. And if you have any interest at all in sharing, I would like to extend an invitation for you to come on the show so we can talk about all things your personal folklore. Whether it's family stories, whether it's stories that you were told as a child, stories that come from your family's culture, whatever it is, I'd love to dive into it because I think that, the kind of podcasts where people bring in experts or authors are great. And obviously I've done that. But I think that folklore is for all of us, and I want to talk more about that. I want to look at how people have folklore in their daily life, how they have it in their family stories, in their cultural stories. So if you have any interest, do get a hold of me. You can shoot me a message on Blue Sky. You can send me an email at folkloringpod@gmail.com or my newest email at folkloringlife@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have a conversation about how folklore fits into and informs your life. So let me know if you're interested at all in that. And also let me know if you think this series sounds interesting, because I have found some great people who have some very unique takes on folklore that is personal to them, which I love. So that is what's coming up next. Feel free to jump in and get involved. That would be absolutely fantastic. And now on to the actual episode about haunted Chicago. Chicago is a very haunted city, and there are far more stories that I could ever tell in, just an episode. So I've tried to focus on a few of the more interesting. Some of these are more famous, and you may have heard of them. Hopefully we'll get into some detail that you haven't heard of. But maybe as someone who's not from Chicago, you haven't heard of these at all. So let's get into it. I'm going to go in mostly chronological order, starting back in 1893 during the Chicago World's Fair. Now, there was a man named Henry Howard Holmes, and he was one of America's first serial killers, and he had 9 victims. He had built a hotel of sorts. It also had shops on the first level on the south side of Chicago and South Loop of Chicago, which is just a little bit south. It wasn't very far from the middle of downtown. Now, he was born Herman Webster Mudgett, and he was sort of a scam artist, right? And a bunch of scandals that he was involved with, a bunch of scams, gave him plenty of reason to change his name to Henry Howard Holmes. Now, the building that he built, this hotel, he began construction on it in 1887, and he said that he was going to use the building for a series of apartments and shops. And the building encompassed an entire city block. Now, when he was building out this hotel, these apartments, he would switch builders really frequently, and also architects. And the reason for this is that he wanted to not let anyone have too much information. He wanted to keep people in the dark about some of the more sinister aspects of this building. Now, once Holmes was eventually arrested, there were lots of rumors about these interior details that he was trying to keep secret. There were stories of hinged walls, false partitions, secret chambers underneath floorboards with iron plate-lined walls that would stifle sound of any, screams or torture that were going on. Now, it was said that his personal apartment, Holmes's apartment, had a trap door in the bathroom, which hid a staircase that led to a windowless, airless cubicle. And in the room, there was allegedly a large chute that tunneled through to the basement. And there was even a room in there that was said to be lined with gas fixtures. And these were all the rumors that were flying around shortly after he was arrested. Now, in the room with the gas fixtures, this is apparently one of the rooms where Holmes would seal in the victim and flip a switch in an adjacent room, and then the horror would begin to unfold as gas started filling up the room. Now, there isn't any evidence that Holmes ever trapped strangers inside his hotel in an attempt to kill them. He wasn't having people come in off the streets and then suddenly spiriting them away. The 9 people that he likely killed were people that he already knew. Now, in 1894, investigators began to suspect Holmes of murdering one of his associates, who was another scammer, and his name was Benjamin Pitzel. And they had some sort of insurance scheme together, and he wanted to shut Benjamin up, and so he murdered him and also his children to try and cover up this insurance scheme. Now, some of the other victims he had, there was a woman named Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl. Now, they disappeared around Christmas time of 1891 after Holmes had had an affair with Julia. So you think your ex is bad. Now, Holmes alternately denied killing Julia, but then at one point he confessed to accidentally killing her. And there were also 3 women that he was accused of killing: Emmeline Segrand, Minnie Williams, and her sister Nanny Williams. And it's thought that he met them in the lobby of the Congress Hotel, which we are going to talk about a little bit later, because the Congress Hotel is in and of itself a very haunted place, and some really fascinating stuff there. Now, the evidence for the murders of Ben Pitzel and his 3 children, Howard, Nellie, and Alice, was the most solid. That being said, investigators were only able to try and convict him for Ben's murder. Now, he received the death sentence for that murder and died by hanging in Philadelphia, and that was about a week before his 35th birthday. So pretty horrific stuff, but again, definitely had a plan, building out that horrible building, and the building is no longer there. Obviously, the site is still there, the address is there. They tore down the building, but it was some time after his death that they tore it down, but you can't go see it now, so don't try. You can probably take a picture on the street where the building used to be, but it won't be the same. The next tragedy I'm going to talk about is something that I learned about a long time ago because I've worked in both theater. I was a stage manager professionally for 10 years, and I worked for almost 20 years in construction. And it's a well-known fact that there are really high standards for safety in buildings in Chicago, specifically theaters. So I had heard about this particular tragedy long ago, back in my theater days. There was a theater called the Iroquois Theater. And on a cold Chicago winter day, December 30th, 1903, and there's a Wednesday matinee that day. The theater had only been open for a few weeks before. And as it was, a holiday week, and it was a matinee, it was a show that was geared toward children. The show was named Mr. Bluebeard, and it was sort of an over-the-top musical comedy, and it starred Chicago native Eddie Foy, who had some notoriety at that time. Now, because it was on a holiday week, the theater was filled with teachers and mothers and children enjoying this show on their holiday break. And the show featured scenes from around the world. Actors were masquerading as animals. There was a ballerina that was suspended above the stage. So it was a really spectacular production. And it was really geared towards sort of prominent families. This show was, they tried to get in prominent families to kind of build up their reputation. Now, there were about 1,700 patrons, and they could not have suspected in any way what was coming that afternoon. Now, this theater was touted as fireproof. They said there were all of these things in place that were, to prevent fire or any, harm or injury from fire. Unfortunately, although much of that stuff was designed into the theater, the construction had gone long and there were delays and they ended up opening late. And so the owners of the theater were losing money and they desperately needed to make that money back. So when they opened the theater, they sort of skirted a few of the laws and requirements for this fireproof theater. So just about the time that the second act began, which was about 3:15 in the afternoon, a spark from a stage light ignited some nearby drapery. And they had some primitive fire retardant that the stagehands tried to use on the fire, but it didn't really have much effect. Now imagine the scene. The audience does not realize yet that they're in danger. It's a spectacular show. They're thinking that this fire is this amazing special effect. So they're all excited. Nobody's getting worked up. And at that point, the stagehands tried to lower an asbestos curtain, and it was one of the earliest asbestos fire curtains, and that was designed to, of course, delay the spread of the fire, but it got snagged and stuck halfway down. So it didn't get all the way down to isolate the stage from the audience. Now, the audience was starting to realize what was happening, and they're getting agitated and upset, and Eddie Foy, who was incidentally dressed in drag for his next scene, he got on stage and attempted to calm the audience down. And he told the orchestra, just keep playing. And so at this point, he's trying to calm them down. They start to realize something is really wrong. People begin to panic. They tried to flee at that point, but many of them were trapped. Now, there were doors that opened to the auditorium area, but they opened inward instead of outward. So as the crush started getting to the exit doors, the people crushed up against the doors made it impossible to open them. Now, additionally, those cuts and shortcuts I was talking about earlier, some of the exits were sealed off by iron gates, and those were designed to keep people that were in the less expensive seats from sneaking into the better seats. Some of the doors that were there were only decorative, and people didn't know, and they were trying to get out of them. A lot of people were trampled in the crowd. Some fell to their death from the balconies, and we'll talk a little bit about how some fell outside as well. Emergency exits that were supposed to be there for safety, again, fireproof theater, they were chained from the outside to prevent people from sneaking into the theater. There were also skylights that were supposed to open up to allow the heat to escape in the event of a fire, but those had been sealed shut. Now, the actors on stage where the fire was are trying to escape as well. So there's a large stage door at the back of the stage. They opened that up to get out. And of course, when the air rushed in, it created this massive fireball that went from the stage out into the audience. And those flames hit a lot of people still in the upper levels, and that killed a lot of people instantaneously. Now, there were some people that were fortunate enough to find upper level fire escapes, and then when they got out there, they realized that there wasn't an exterior ladder down to the ground. That had been, a shortcut as well. And when they got out onto these fire escapes, they realized that they were really icy and dangerous. Now, there were workmen in a building across the alley, and they tried to lay planks out to create sort of a makeshift bridge. And they did save a handful of patrons, but the first two people that attempted to get across this wooden plank slipped and fell to their deaths in the alley. Now, within minutes, hundreds of bodies that couldn't find a way out began piling up inside the theater. And people were dying of smoke inhalation. They were being burned. They turned a diner next door into both a morgue and a hospital. And doctors that showed up were trying to find living victims. Friends and family who were panicked began to descend on the restaurant to see if their loved one had somehow escaped. And word of the staggering death toll of these women and children started to spread, and the city was overcome by a state of collective mourning. But as people started to get over the shock, that feeling quickly gave way to anger and outrage. And obviously, the theater had been advertised as absolutely fireproof, and so how could these hundreds of people perish so rapidly? Who was responsible for it? And a few days later, the Chicago Tribune ran a list of regulations that had been ignored during the construction of the Iroquois, including a lack of adequate fire alarm, no automatic sprinklers, no marked exits, no suitable fire extinguishing devices. And even the two large flues on the rooftop where the smoke and flame could have been vented out were boarded shut. Now, the newspaper at the time said, quote, "The only atonement that can be made for these hapless victims of negligence is to make the theaters of Chicago absolutely safe, so none other may meet their fate." And so, on the upside, it did really set the stage for when the regulations were upgraded, and there really was a very high level of safety concern, and the city really started taking the inspections more seriously and making sure that people were safe when they're going to these, larger gatherings. And it also translated to other buildings in Chicago. Now, this is not to say that the Iroquois Theater was the only fire. In the early 1900s, there was a series of fires, maybe not of this magnitude, but there were school fires and theater fires and opera house fires, and lots of people died very quickly. And so this particular fire was a catalyst and really forced Chicago to take a look at how they regulated large public spaces. And the question was, how much of it was because they had ignored building codes, and how much of it was that the building codes just didn't go far enough. Now, sadly, nobody was ever really held criminally liable. There were numerous lawsuits from victims' families. Those died out. Basically, the people didn't have the heart to fight about it, and so a lot of that died out. However, Chicago City Council did start passing new building ordinances, and they wanted some structural changes to the new standards. And so these new standards included sizes for aisles, number of exits, use of fireproofing in scenery, fire alarms that were actually connected, better limits on occupancy levels, the elimination altogether of standing room tickets, changes to what the sprinkler requirements were, new rules for the rooftop flues, like the ones that had been nailed shut, panic bars for emergency exits. And this was a very interesting one because there was a man, he was a hardware salesman, and his name was Carl Prinzler. And he had originally planned to actually be at the performance of Mr. Bluebeard on the day of the fire. But for some reason, he decided to go to work instead. And he went on, he was so upset and shook by what had happened and how narrowly he had missed it, that he went on to work with colleagues to invent the crash bar mechanism on doors that prevented entry from the outside, but could be easily opened in, times of duress. And I'm sure you've all seen what a panic bar looks like. You just press it and the door opens. And so that kind of design has been used for well over a century now. And so, although a terrible tragedy, some good did come out of it. So if you happen to be in Chicago, the building is still there, the alley is still there, and there are many reports of ghosts, spirits in the alley of people who fell on their way, spirits of children, and the other people that died in that tragedy. Another tragedy that happened a few years later, on the morning of July 24th in 1915, there was an annual picnic planned for the employees of the Western Electric Company. And thousands of people gathered at the riverfront. At about 6:30 a.m., passengers began to board the Eastland, which was on the Chicago River. And by about 10-11 minutes later, 6:40, the vessel began listing to the starboard side. Now, the crew let water into the ship's ballast tanks to sort of even out that imbalance. But soon, the Eastland began listing again, but this time to port. Now, at 7:10, boarding ended as the ship reached its limit of 2,500 passengers. Now, by 7:25, 15 minutes later, the Eastland had been righted several times because it kept listing back and forth. Now, at that time, it began sort of its final fatal list. Now, within about 2 minutes after 7:25, it was listing to port at least 25 degrees, and water was entering the ship. But it started to move away from the dock at approximately 7:30 a.m. And as it moved away from the dock, the Eastland rolled onto its side. Now, onlookers tried to rush to aid the passengers, and they called the police and the fire department. They arrived shortly after, but despite this, hundreds of people were drowned or crushed between the boat and the river wall. Now, there was a lot of speculation as to why this had happened. There was an investigation launched, and the crew was found not guilty of any wrongdoing. And a federal court held that the owner of the Eastland was not liable since the ship had passed inspections and had been deemed seaworthy. And the plan had been they were going to go out onto Lake Michigan and across the lake for this picnic. But obviously the boat didn't get very far. Now, one of the things that people speculate about this, now they say it's possible that the ship's ballast system was inadequate, and it had a very narrow design that may have contributed to it listing like that. However, one of the theories is that because the ship was carrying additional lifeboats and rafts that it had not been initially designed for, but it was carrying them because of a new law that had been passed after the Titanic catastrophe, which was only 3 years earlier. And they think that it made the craft top-heavy, and that's why this happened all of a sudden. So at the time that it tipped over, it was only in 20 feet of water. And a couple of years later, they sold it to the U.S. Navy. They didn't use it as, a cruise ship anymore. It did get converted into a gunboat, and in 1918, it entered service as the USS Wilmette. However, World War I ended before the vessel saw any combat, and then it was used as a training vessel until 1945, at which point it was sold for scrap. Now, they say that this section of the river where it tipped over, you can still hear the people screaming in terror. You can sometimes see ghostly figures trying to get out of the water. So that's definitely something to check out if you make it to Chicago. Another place to check out if you're interested in haunted places, places with a lot of history. I said I would get back to this, and now I am. I want to talk a little bit about the Congress Hotel. Now, the Congress Hotel was once known as the home of presidents because so many presidents stayed there. But it also has a long-standing reputation as the home of ghosts. So, to start with, there have been many, many documented suicides at the hotel. Sadly, too many to even think about putting together any kind of list. However, one of the most infamous suicides was that of a Spanish-American war veteran, and his name was Captain Louis Ostheim of the 1st United States Artillery. Now, it was the evening of April 8th, 1900. The hotel had only been in business about 7 years. It was the eve of Ostheim's wedding, and he was staying at the hotel by himself. And while he was in his room, he took a gun, pointed it at his head, pulled the trigger, and ended his life. But he didn't leave a suicide note, and no apparent reason was ever given for the suicide. And there were 2 wedding rings that were found in the room with his body. Sightings of the ghost has been reported throughout the building, and he's known as the Shadow Man of the Congress. Another story of ghostly appearances happens on the 12th floor. And the 12th floor is supposed to be haunted by a little boy named Carol Langer, who died a horrible death at the hotel in 1939. Now, in August of that year, Adele Langer, who was 43 at the time, came to the hotel with her 2 sons, Carol Tommy, who was 6, and Jan Misha, who was 4.5. Now, they had come to the United States about a month earlier from what was at the time Czechoslovakia, and they fled there when the Nazis took over. Now, they were trying to establish residency in the U.S., and Adele first came with the 2 boys on a 6-month visitor's visa, while her husband, who was also named Carol, stayed behind working to try and sell their home and his textile mill in Prague, according to a contemporary Chicago Tribune article. Now, in the newspaper account, the senior Carol Langer is quoted as saying that his wife had been depressed since she'd left Czechoslovakia and had talked of committing suicide and taking the babies with her. The boys had been attending a camp to learn English, but they didn't like it, so they returned back to the hotel. So, on a beautiful, sunny August afternoon, Mrs. Langer first took the kids to Lincoln Park Zoo, and they apparently had a wonderful day. Now, when they returned to the hotel, originally it was reported that the hotel room was on the 13th floor, but then other sources say it was, in fact, on the 12th. And I wonder, I'd be very curious to know if there is a 13th floor. Maybe it was floor 13, but they weren't counting it that way, because often, places like that don't have a 13th floor listed. But what happened was, once they returned to the hotel, Mrs. Langer apparently caught up in the grips of her depression, threw the 2 young boys out the window to their deaths, and then she leapt out the window herself. And the 3 bodies landed on Michigan Avenue. Now, the ghost of 6-year-old Carol is said to now haunt the 12th floor. There are even rumors about other areas of the hotel. Some say that some of the ballrooms are haunted. There is the Gold Room, which is supposedly haunted by the ghost of a woman in old Victorian clothing. And some say they've even photographed her, but I could not find evidence of an existing photograph. Now, in addition to being the home of presidents and the home of ghosts, it's possible that the Congress Hotel might even be the home of ghosts of presidents. Now, former President Teddy Roosevelt made the announcement at that hotel that he was leaving the Republican Party and forming a new party. But in the context that he had just lost the presidential nomination for the GOP that year. Now, he reportedly made that announcement in the Florentine room at the hotel, and some say that it is still haunted by his ghost. There are definitely other very haunted rooms. Room 441 on the 4th floor, and that's in the South Tower, is considered by many people to be one of the most haunted rooms in the hotel, or maybe even the most haunted room. There's been lots of people that have called security because they see a woman standing or hovering over the bed, or pushing or tugging on the bed, or pushing or tugging on the covers. Now, nobody knows who this woman is, but a lot of people have reported her. Some say they've even seen her coming in and out of the bathroom. Now, if you are really interested in some of these hauntings, the Congress Hotel's current website that is up and live, I just checked it earlier today, lists several rooms that are haunted that you can check the availability for, and you can book a stay, and you just have to work with them. So these rooms, the first one is room 242, and this apparition is called the Woman in the White Dress. Now, room 242 will sleep 2 people. It has 1 double bed. Now, the story goes that there was a young woman, and she was on a long stay at the hotel. She was troubled, going through a hard time in her life, and she started saying things like she wanted the voices to stop. And other guests and the staff started becoming concerned. They eventually called the authorities because she was acting so erratic. But unfortunately, it was too late. And sadly, she took her own life. But her spirit is rumored to have never left room 242. And people report a heaviness while in the room. Some of them say that a woman in a long white dress sits on the edge of the bed watching them sleep. Others report a feeling that someone was laying in bed next to them. So who knows? Maybe she's looking for company, maybe she's lonely, or maybe she's seeking to escape some of the darkness that clouded her life. We probably won't ever know the real story, but if you do stay in that room, I'd be very curious to hear how your story goes. Now, another room is room 220, and this room sleeps 4. It's got 2 double beds, and they called this the Tricky Veteran Room. Now, there was a World War II veteran who came to the Hotel Congress in 1965, and he never moved out. Now, he would follow the same routine every day. He would get up, go downstairs, get breakfast with, a small plate. He'd get some sort of bread with butter, and then he'd go back upstairs to eat. And when he finished, he'd always leave the dirty cup and plate outside his room for cleaning service. But for some reason, he never returned the butter knife. And so he was sort of a handyman, and he would use these knives to fix various things around the hotel. So he was kind of living there and, sort of off the record was fixing things. Now, he was a bit of a trickster, and after he passed, and this was in 2001, remember, he moved in 1965. He stayed there until he died in 2001. But after that, housekeepers and guests started finding butter knives from the restaurant outside of the room and in other random places throughout the property. So apparently he also enjoys locking and unlocking the door, as well as moving guests' items around. So apparently he just wants to be friends. So if you stay in room 220, I would love to hear that story. The next one is room 214. This room sleeps 2. It has 1 king bed in it, and it is called the Victorian Gentleman's Room. Now, there is a stately man that seems to be attached to this room. He is dressed in a seersucker suit, and it's also thought that he might wander the halls of the hotel, maybe an after-dinner stroll. Sometimes he's even seen in a top hat, looking very pulled together and dapper. Now, some guests have claimed to see him standing in the window and watching people mix in the plaza below, only to find out later that the room was actually empty that night. So he seems friendly as well, so that might be a good room to try. The last one that the Congress Hotel lists on their website as a haunted room that you can stay in is room 212. And this sleeps 2 people. It has 1 king-size bed, and it's called the Locksmith Apprentice. Now, a night in room 212 typically starts out very normal. But as the evening wears on, you may experience some supernatural goings-on. Now, some guests have reported locking the door, turning in for the night, only to find the door open again a little bit later. Now, the lock opening can go on until the guest just decides to leave the door open instead of continuing with the game. Now, that only works until the door mysteriously starts to close as well. So even apparently the staff there has seen and heard this phenomenon. So maybe just a budding locksmith having a little bit of fun. Okay, so I am going to start to move toward the folkloring part of this episode, and I'm going to do that by talking about something that you could try if you're in Chicago, and that is the Couch Mausoleum urban legend. Now, the Couch Mausoleum is at the south end of Lincoln Park, and this is a site that used to be Chicago City Cemetery. And it was sort of at the outskirts of town until the city started building up around it. And then that land got to be very desirable. And so the people that were buried in the city cemetery, they got moved further out to different cemeteries. Now, the Couch Mausoleum is a stone mausoleum, and it has the family name of Couch on it. And it is the oldest structure still standing within the fire zone of the Great Chicago Fire. And it memorializes the businessman Ira Couch, who was a wealthy hotel owner. And when the cemetery was moved in 1866, the Couch family refused permission to dismantle the mausoleum, and they took the city to court, and they won. And so they were able to keep the mausoleum intact, even though all of the rest of the cemetery was moved. And part of the reason the cemetery was closed was due to poor sanitary conditions. It is kind of marshland in that area, and so when the caskets were buried, they would sometimes wash ashore when lake levels rose, and the decomposing remains also contaminated drinking water and caused several cholera outbreaks. Now, the urban legend part of it, and the part that you might want to try, and I'm dying to hear if you do this and see what happens. So around the late 1880s, newspapers began reporting that there was this legend involving the structure. And the story went that if you came to the mausoleum at the stroke of midnight, any night of the week, and faced it, looking up at the name Couch, and said, "The graves belong to the dead, not the living," 3 times, the door would swing open and a big white ghost would come out and greet you. So, if you do that, please get back to me. I want to know. I might go try it. Maybe again once it gets to be the fall and I'm thinking all things spooky. So if I do that, I will let you know. And if you're in Chicago or gonna be in Chicago anytime in the near future, if you want to do that with me, definitely track me down and we will try it. And we will be out at midnight chanting strange things in Lincoln Park, which I think sounds like a riot. So, besides doing that, what can you do for folkloring? Now, I know this episode is a little bit different. It's a little bit harder to incorporate this in your day-to-day life. But obviously, you can visit haunted places in Chicago or wherever home is. You can go on a tour. You can see if you can find some ghost hunters that want to, take you on a hunt. You can read about some of these stories and learn more about it. It's fascinating. There's so much more in here that I did not get to, so feel free to do some research and find out about these stories. The other thing is, we talk about ghost stories. I think that they can be great inspiration for our own ghost stories. I have ghost stories, and if you have your own ghost stories, I think that telling them and telling your experiences with them is really fascinating and really fun, and a really good way to, pay attention to the symbolism of spirits or the reality of spirits, if that's what you believe. So anyway, hopefully this gives you a couple of ideas, and hopefully it makes you feel like the cooler weather and the fall are a little bit closer, unless, of course, if you're in the southern hemisphere, in which case I hope that spring comes for you soon, and keep on folkloring. Thanks, everybody.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.